guys, we have one of the engines done for the Fiero Red, Fiero Blue. This engine is for Fiero Red, as you can tell by the red distributor cap. As Ronaldo told me, one of his cars has a red cap on it, one has blue, so that's how we're going to distinguish our engines. Now, before we go ahead and start with the new engine build, which I'm going to take you through with step by step, I just want to show you the details that we added to this engine, which is complete now. You can see let's see if we can focus. Focus, camera. Come on. There we go. You can see we have added our AC compressor with the extra belt, and you can see how seamlessly the belt just fits with the rest of the belt drive assembly. So it looks like it's actually part of the kit, which actually came out pretty cool. We have our oil filter with a decal that I got from another kit. I had a whole bunch of these decals left over from some other kits, and this one had an SCP logo that fits perfectly on that oil filter. So that works beautifully. We have our starter in there all painted up. You can see we have our spark plug wires, which we're going to go through that, as I said, step by step, the way we put this engine together. Everything's in there. The transmission's there. The exhaust is done. So this is our completed assembly. And that's what it's going to look like when it's done. When the next one is done. So we're going to walk through that one. Let's just put this to the side there. Oh, just for references, we're going to see this is the first. You can see the gray one. This is our test shot build. And you can see the differences in the belt drive assemblies. I think the new one is a definite improvement over what they wanted to give you on the kit. Another thing you can see is that there is the fuel pump hanging off the side of the block, which is not correct for this car. So we have eliminated that. Otherwise, it's all pretty much the same. You can see the distributor here, which is actually a perfect distributor for modifying to add wires. And we're going to go over that as we build the second engine. Okay, so let's get started on this. Now, first thing we're going to talk about is the block. As you can see that, let's see if we can zoom this in a little more. Valve covers are pretty simple, straightforward. You just glue them to the top of the block and make sure that they're just squared off with the cylinder head, and you'll be fine. Now, when installing the lower intake manifold, you have to make sure you get it even with that notch. And you're going to find that it doesn't sit completely flush with the block. And what I found from building the other one is that you're better off just installing one valve cover, then the intake manifold, then the other valve cover, as opposed to the instructions where they want you to install the valve covers and then they cover installing one, and then there is no reference to installing the other one. So, but these 3, 4, 5, yeah, there is no information toward installing the other valve covers. So I guess they consider both valve covers one step. And then they want you to do the intake manifold. But what I found that it's going to be easier if you install one valve cover, the intake manifold, then the other valve cover. That just means you can adjust everything more to better make everything just fit a little smoother. All right, so let's put a little bit of just put a drop of super glue on there, and we're going to lock all of that in place. There we go. So now our intake manifold is on. And now we're going to install the other valve cover. And there we have our valve covers installed. Now, one thing you have to note is that you want to make sure you see the marks in the valve cover, the lines in there, and then there's a little longer rectangular area, you have to make sure that that faces outward the same as this, because you can't put them on backwards, so that your valve covers look uniform. You have to make sure of that. So there we go. We have our basic part of the block done. Now we're going to let that dry for a bit before we move on to the next step, in which we're going to install the distributor and then the rest of the intake manifolds. All right, now the order in which the instructions want you to put everything together will work, but it might be a little easier if you bounce around back and forth between step 1 and step 2, as you want to have the parts installed which are not going to get in your way and, you know, have you accidentally knock something off in order to put something else on. So I'm going to tell you the order in which I did these things. Now we've already gone over the valve covers and the lower intake manifold. Now I put the oil filter on now because you're going to have to work around that, as when the exhaust goes on, the oil filter, you're going to have to go in behind the exhaust to put the oil filter on. And it gets a little more, you know, it can be a little bit more difficult that way. So if you put the oil filter on now, which basically it's just a small peg and you just attach the canister to the peg and you're done, then install this rear manifold so that now you can start aligning things up when you get ready to put the rest of the exhaust on. Now the rear manifold, in order to put that on, that gets a little tricky, because on this particular one, which I didn't see on the other one, the manifold, the hole of the manifold, the pin on the manifold going into cylinder number 2, which is here on the front of the engine, the pin wouldn't go in all the way and the manifold wouldn't sit straight. So I actually had to go in and drill that out a little bit in order to widen the hole and allow the manifold to sit. Now what we're going to do is, I'm in the process of drilling the holes for the spark plug. So I'm going to show you what I do with that. Take my little pin vise, and I already have the spaces where they're going to go planned out, and I'm going to drill my holes, making sure to keep them as close to level with each other as possible. And then it's just a process of drilling through the plastic with your pin vise. Now this works very easily. As you can see, you don't have to put a lot of pressure in. Just hold it against the plastic and spin the vise as you go, and it'll start to bite into the plastic and cut through it. And you'll be able to tell because the shavings of the plastic will travel up the drill as you're drilling in. The drill, in effect, is cleaning out the hole and removing the excess material. And as soon as you poke through, you'll feel the pin vise fall into the cylinder head, and you are done. Then you just pull it out, and there's your second hole. This is a 6-cylinder. We only need one more. So we need the one offset hole here, which will cover our last cylinder. So I'm going to just go ahead and drill these holes out. You guys can just hang out with me, and we'll do some drilling. Okay, guys, and there you go. You can see the holes are drilled. 3 spark plugs on this side and 3 on that side once we get rid of our shavings. There's still a little bit left in there, but we'll clean that out in a second. And there we go. As you can see, before adding the rest of the intake manifold, we put a little bit of Tamiya panel line paint just to bring out some of the details, along as also on the bolts of the valve covers. So that's our next step in detailing done. Now we're not going to put on the other exhaust manifold until we get the transmission in, so that we can line up the exhaust pipe itself on the two manifolds, because there is a little bit, it's not as precise as it should be, so there is a little bit of adjustment that you'll have to make. This is why I only installed one of the manifolds, and then the other one will be done as we're putting everything together. Now the distributor, as I said before, is a perfect distributor for wiring a car. It's a two-piece distributor. The flat upper portion of it gets glued to the distributor cap itself, as this is more of a distributor for a V8 than it is for this particular car. But that flat top gives you the perfect platform for drilling out all of your holes for your spark plug wires. I've already done it, so there's no need to go over that now. So now we just need to install the distributor into our manifold. I'll just take a drop of super glue right into and we'll just drop our distributor right in there. And here we go. Our engine's starting to come together. All the different colors, really giving you a lot of detail to look at. I really do like the fact that he has so many different colors spread throughout the car, which is going to give each one its own character. So we're going to let that dry there for a second. And we're going to take a look at our front cover and belt drive assembly. Here you can get a good look at all the work that we've done to add an extra pulley to the belt drive and all the detail painting that we've done to it. Okay. Now, what order you do everything in is really going to be up to you, as the order they tell you to do everything in is not really gospel and as far as building this kit goes, and you can just start putting it together in whatever order you see that makes the assembly easier for you. Now, the order that I'm doing it in is just because it's something that for me seems to make more logical sense than what they have in their instructions. So then now that we have those smaller parts on the side of the engine done, we have our holes drilled for our spark plugs, we have our distributor installed, now we can install our middle intake manifold, which they call a ram injection port, which is not really. And we're going to glue this to the lower intake manifold. Now, unlike on the real car, there really is no front and back to this lower intake manifold, as it can be installed in either direction. Which is probably a good thing with this kit, as the fit of pieces are not really that precise. But here we have the middle intake manifold is now installed. Now, if you try to do this on the real car and you got it backwards, you're taking it all apart, because there is a front and a back to this middle intake manifold on the real car. And if you don't put it in the right way, you will be taking it apart to put it back in the right way. Ask me how I know. So there we have our middle intake manifold installed. And other than putting in the other manifold, we are pretty much done with step 2A, which means now we move into step 2B, to start putting the rest of it together. Now what I want to do first is I'm going to attach the transmission, because that's going to help us line up everything as far as the rest of the exhaust goes. Now the transmission, in order to line it up, you do have one D-shaped pin here. Now it's not a really precise fit, so you're gonna have to line up on the transmission housing. You're gonna have to line up the shape on the top. Let me see if we can show you that. You see the back of the block has a shape that's the same as the transmission housing. Now that's what you're gonna have to line up to have the transmission in the proper orientation. And then you can just press it in, and it holds pretty well. Well, not pretty well, but it holds okay to that D-shaped pin. You see that there? And once you get that together, the transmission will be in the proper orientation. Now, one thing I noted before is that you see the seam on the engine block? It's covered on the bottom by the oil pan, on the back by the transmission, and on the front by the timing cover. Pretty ingenious of them and on the top by the intake. So it's pretty ingenious of them to get rid of all the seams on this engine for you, so you don't have to do so much work. So let's just attach the transmission to the back of the engine. Now we're going to have to let that sit and set up so that we don't knock it off. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the starter. Where is the starter? Okay guys, we're gonna have to find that starter. And since we have to wait for this to dry, I think it's a good spot for us to stop right here until everything really dries and cures. Don't want to mess with it too much. Alright guys, we have our starter now. Didn't get eaten by the carpet monster. So now we're going to go ahead and install the starter into the transmission, which I recommend you do now, as it's a slightly awkward placement of the starter, which makes it a little tough to get in there and actually, well, actually if you put it in the right way, just putting it in backwards. And there we go. That's how our starter is going to sit once it's located into the transmission. So first thing we're going to do is just put a drop of super glue in there. There we go. One small drop is all we need. And there is our starter installed. Much easier to do it here before you put the exhaust and everything in, as that way you have nothing in your way. Similar to what we did with the oil filter. So now that we have the transmission in place, now we can start putting the rest of the exhaust on, as the transmission is where the exhaust is going to rest. If you see this here, and this will help you to actually place your transmission. You can put a drop of super glue on the transmission itself to hold the exhaust in place, and you should be able to seat everything perfectly. Make sure we don't knock the starter off. Similar to what we did right here, where you can see the placement of the transmission. of the exhaust on the transmission. I recommend putting a drop of super glue right there where the transmission sits over, where the exhaust sits over this part of the transmission to hold it in place, and that will allow you to attach it to both manifolds. The first thing we have to do is install the other manifold in order to give us a place to put the exhaust. So we're going to try to test fit our exhaust manifold first. And that's going to be a good fit right there. Now, as we did on the other one, we have two notches here, and that's where the pegs from the exhaust manifold are going to sit in to hold the manifold onto the engine block. And so we just have to apply some super glue here and in that notch. And there. And there we go. Our exhaust manifold is installed. Now we have the exhaust pipe attached to the manifold, which we're going to have to do a little touch-up painting on that to make that look a little bit better. But as you can see, that was very tricky to assemble. So now what we have is the major assemblies done. Now we can install the alternator onto the drive belt assembly. Okay, that's going to be easy. Just a little pop, and there we go. Our alternator is installed. There we go. Now when installing the alternator, make note of, let's see, we gotta zoom in on this to get it a little clearer. There we go. Make note of the little notches on top of the alternator and on the bottom of the alternator, as that is where the tips of the front of the alternator slot into to hold the alternator in a proper orientation. Okay, and now we're going to attach the AC compressor. And we're going to put that right there. Okay, and now we have our AC compressor installed on our belt drive assembly. Just make sure we get that in there straight. Now we'll do a little test fit of our belt drive assembly to the front of the block. And there we go. Now, before we attach everything else, we're going to apply our decals to the engine, as it'll be easier to do that now. Okay, now, for the decals, I have sourced from a couple of models that I have decals left over from. This is from my Revell Porsche, whoopsie daisy, drop that in there, 914, which gave me a whole bunch of decals that I could play with. And this one is from the Opel GT model, I think. Now what I'm going to be taking is, from the Porsche, are these silver squares, if you can see that there, and applying that to the AC compressor, almost like if it has a manufacturer label or something on it. And then for the oil filter, we will be applying an STP brand label. So we'll just let those sit there for a second. And we'll be using a little bit of microsol just to get them to sit properly without fighting us too much. I love the microsol and the microset, as they really work well for melting the decals and getting them to sit right where you want. I'm just going to go straight to the microsol, as these small decals will definitely need a bit of convincing to go where I want them to go. Okay, as everything moves, and here we go. Now we're just going to go ahead and move our decal right there. It's perfect. Now this is a detail that probably no one else is going to notice is there but me. But I think it's cool just to put it there. There we go. Put you aside to dry. And now for the STP label on the oil filter, which is going to be even trickier. Okay, I'm going to need my tweezers. Okay. Now we're just going to use the cotton bud to conform it around the oil filter. There we go. And then we'll hit it with a little bit of microsol to soften it up and get it to stay right where we want it. Okay, guys. And there we go, our STP branded oil filter. Alright guys, now that we have our oil filter and AC compressor decal in place, now we're going to install the front cover onto the engine. Now if you look at the engine, you'll see you'll have this moon-shaped opening here, which goes to this shaped pin here. Now you would think that it's going to be an easy alignment, nothing to write home about, going to be in there nice and simple. It's not. It's a very imprecise fit, as you can see how much movement there is in that pin. So you have to make sure you align the front cover perfectly to the tops of the cylinder heads in order to make sure that it's sitting straight. And that's going to be very important for aligning the engine inside the car. So we're going to go ahead and put our super glue to use. And I gotta tell you, I really like this little tester bottle of super glue. It just works beautifully, dries quick, and makes assembly a breeze. Okay, so now we're going to install the pin into the slot. Make sure that we have this lined up with the cylinder head. And I think we are good. Oops, good to go. Just about right there. Like I said, this is a nice kit, but it does have its imperfections and quite a few areas where it could use a little more of the Tamiya style engineering, as the fit of some of the parts is not perfect, imprecise a bit, but it does build up into a very nice assembly. Okay, so now the last part of our engine is to install the intake, which is very simple. We just glue it right there and we are done with the engine. And that's just 2 pins, as you can see here and here. And then we'll just run a little bit of super glue across the top of the intake there, just to make sure we get a good contact area. And here we go. Let's just make sure we don't knock that off before it has a chance to harden, because that generally sucks to do, and that we don't knock off the Okay, let me just hold this down here, make sure that everything glues down where it's supposed to. And now we let that dry a little bit. And now we have our second engine done, except for the spark plug wires. They both came out pretty good, if I do say so myself. I'm going to be doing a little bit of detail painting, attaching our spark plug wires, and then we'll be ready to move on to the next major assembly, which we're going to start with the interior next. But guys, we're going to do the spark plug wires next, and then we'll be done. Okay guys, now for the spark plug wires, I'm going to be using MCW 3002 red engine detail wire. They make great products. I use them on a lot of my builds, and this wire is like seems to me to be the perfect diameter for a realistic 1/24 to 1/25 scale wire. Now, I've already cut this piece of wire out, and I just wanted to show you what I'm doing with the end here is, I know there are ways to make boots for the ends of the wires, but this distributor is kind of small, and I don't know if I have room to do that. So what I do is I just paint the end of the wire black to simulate the boot, which I completely forgot to do on the other car, but I'm going to do it on this one. And then we'll have the wire, which looks like it has a boot going into the distributor. So now we just put a drop of super glue on the end. And we will pop our wire into our pre-drilled hole in the distributor cap. Now, I mentioned how this particular style distributor is perfect for wiring, as it gives you a nice flat surface with which to insert your wires. We've already drilled the holes, so now all we have to do is basically run our wire to the cylinder of our choice, which this is going to be cylinder number 1. Once we let our super glue dry, because the worst thing is to start putting this in and then just have them pop right out. What we're going to do is use our latest and greatest additions to the stash, which is this 1/16 by 12-inch heat shrink tubing. I showed previously how you can make the heat shrink tubing by using a larger diameter and just simply heating it up to shrink it down, and then you can stretch it to make it even thinner. This will hopefully be small enough in diameter that I won't have to do that, as it is a bit smaller, I think, in size than, yep, it is a little smaller and thinner. So let's see how this works as a spark plug boot. Test it on our spool of wire here. Slide it in, and looks like it's still just a little too big, so we're going to try shrinking this down and seeing what diameter we get. Okay guys, after heating up this heat shrink tubing, I found that it does actually come out to the perfect size for recreating a spark plug boot. So now all we have to do basically is insert our wire into our pre-drilled hole in the block, and then slide our boot down so we get the right distance from the block. Then we'll droop the wire because you want the effect of gravity on your wires. You don't want them to appear to be floating in space. And there we go, guys. We have our first spark plug wire with boot inserted into the engine block. Now we're just going to run the rest of them and we'll be back with the finished product. Alright guys, here we have both drivetrain assemblies fully completed. Fiero Red and Fiero Blue, both their engines are done and wired up. Unless I decide to add some more details to them. I think we're going to call the two power plants done. As you can see, Fiero Red with the red distributor cap and Fiero Blue with the blue distributor cap that you'll see coming around in a second. Both engines are wired with spark plug boots. Both came out pretty nice, if I do say so myself. You can see the decals for the oil filter and the label on the AC compressor. Let's just look at them side by side here. Here we have both engines, and no matter how much you try and build them exactly the same, there always seem to be minor little differences, either in the way the plastic sits, the parts go together. The fit is not anywhere near as precise as a Tamiya kit, but for an MPC kit, it really isn't that bad. Did some Tamiya panel line paint to bring accent some of the details in the transmission. Those decals on the engines add a nice little touch to them. I'm very, very happy with the way this came out. Okay, so the first sub-assembly is gone, and we are going to get ready for the next. Well, while we're here, let's put it in. Move over, guys, and let's take a look at it with the test shot engine. You can see it's quite a bit of difference paint makes and the extra detailing from the way it was meant to be built. So I think it's very interesting to see them the way they were intended to be built from the manufacturer and with what you can do with them. Which makes a world of difference. Even though I really do like the test shot look. It looks almost like a blueprint. So there you go, guys. Alright, that's going to be it for the second and final part of the, well, unless I decide to add more details, which knowing me, I probably will. But for now, the engines are done. Alright, guys, that's it. And just come back for the next one, because there's a lot more fun coming up. Alright, see you on the next one, guys.